Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Core of Everything. We'd like to start today with a couple of shout-outs.
Yeah, we were absolutely thrilled to get a video sent in by one of our listeners. Hannah from London sent an on-location little clip of how excited she was about the geology surrounding her on her holiday. So thank you so much for that, Hannah. If you have any things you want to send in to us or questions or comments, you can get in touch via Instagram, Twitter, or on our Spotify page.
Yep, on Instagram, that's at Copod, and on Twitter, it's at the Copod. I'd also like to have a quick shout out to the Makins in Aberdare that have been commenting on our Spotify page, and thank you. I think we are doing a good job. But today we've got a lot on our plate. It's time to get into the crust of the matter. You guessed it, folks. We're looking at plate tectonics. So let's dive in. Okay, so let's start by recapping Earth's interior from episode 2. So we have our solid inner core, liquid outer core, our mantle, and then our crust. And now the crust is composed of oceanic crust, which is about 5 kilometers thick, and the continental crust, which at its thickest is up to maybe 50 kilometers thick. We have our upper mantle, which has the asthenosphere within it, which is sort of this semi-plastic, ductile part of the mantle.
And ductile basically means it's bendy, right?
Bendy, yeah, exactly. It's almost solid, but with a tiny bit of melting. I think it's like 0.1% melting. Mm. It's almost like cheese that's slightly melted, that sort of thing. So it's still, so you can sort of slightly bend it, like a cheddar, not like a
cheese that you've left on the back seat of your car.
yeah, a sweaty cheese. And then you've got this small portion of upper mantle and the crust that sit above the asthenosphere, and this makes up the lithosphere. And the crust is made up of a lot of large slabs known as plates. We have 7 or 8 major plates with a lot of smaller ones called platelets. So that's 15 to 20 sort of plates roughly in total. It's, if you think about the crust really around the mantle, around the cores, it's more like an egg with a broken shell. I like to think of it. And these plates move up to maybe 10 centimeters against each other annually. And the question is, how do they form? Well, it actually seems to be a little unknown how it all got started in the first place. You know, how do you break up one large piece of crust around the planet into smaller bits of crust known as plates? And generally there's this idea that a magma ocean formed in the primitive Earth around 4.5 to 4 billion years ago. And this cooled into a single unbroken plate for the first 500 million years. And then in 2014, there was a paper in Nature by Berkovici and Rickard. About 4 billion years ago, these cooler parts of Earth, as it cooled and crystallized, these cooler parts of Earth's crust were pulled downwards into the warmer upper mantle, which damaged the surrounding crust. And that formed the sort of first subduction zone, which is when one piece of crust sort of sinks underneath the other. And that formed our first boundary. And then tectonics themselves formed probably 3 billion years ago.
So tectonics is this whole regime of plates moving, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you have these different boundaries that separate each plate. There's also a paper in Nature in 2015 which shows that the hotter temperatures of early Earth meant that the crust was more easily broken up by something called a plume, which is essentially an upward flow of hot material from Earth's mantle that sort of broke the crust above.
And that's because that stuff's more buoyant, right?
Exactly.
It wants to get to the
and
surface.
It rises, exactly. Yeah. But the question is, how was this all discovered? How were plates discovered?
Yeah, so this kind of all began with a guy called Alfred Wegener, who was a German geophysicist mostly. He did a lot of other things as well. And he published a couple of papers in 1912 discussing continental drift, which weren't very well received at the time. But these were basically saying that things on the surface of the Earth move around, and once upon a time they were probably all stuck together. So he suggested there was this supercontinent called Pangaea. Pangaea means all lands or all the Earth, 200 million years ago, and that broke into pieces and separated apart. So evidence for this included things like matching rock formations, structures, and similar fossils, particularly in Brazil and West Africa. And if you look at a map, you might see that South America and Africa look like they fit together.
Yeah, and they also correlate through, say, fossils, but I think there's some land and marine reptile fossils that you can see that extend from across different continents, like South America and Africa. Mesosaurus being one of them.
And that's also the long-necked.
Well, it was more of a reptile. I think it was sort of had a long tail rather than a long neck.
Right.
It might have a long neck as well. It might be like a really elongated, stretched animal. But you also have plants. I think the I pronounce it Glossopteris. Is that how you pronounce it? From that time, it's a fossil now found in Australia, South America, Africa, India, and Antarctica as well. So it shows that they correlate across all these different continents. So it must have been present as one big landmass.
Yeah, because plants can't fly across these massive oceans.
And also the range of, environments.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, Alfred actually died at 50 when he was on an expedition to Greenland, so he never kind of saw this theory take off. But in the 50s and 60s is when it kind of gained momentum. And this was partly because of various technological developments during the World Wars, including seismometers, which detect earthquakes, and magnetometers, which at the time were being used to detect submarines. And using this equipment, they found earthquakes happen in specific places. And using these kind of technological advances, they started to create maps of the ocean floor, and they found a massive undersea mountain range across the Earth. And later, I think it was a Canadian geologist called Harry Hess, suggested that this was due to molten rock rising up from the asthenosphere, creating this ridge. As it cooled, it made new crust, and that there were plates at the surface spreading apart at a ridge, a bit like a conveyor belt. And then after millions of years, this crust would disappear into ocean trenches. And we'll talk about that process a little bit later on. And this was also supported by getting magnetic data of the ocean floor and finding young crust by these spreading centres, suggesting seafloor spreading, and then looking at the kind of magnetic signatures as you move away from that ridge and seeing that there's changes. Do you want to speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we could delve into that. Well, when lava is erupted onto the ocean floor, it contains a lot of, basalts themselves contain a lot of iron, which, as they solidify, the iron-rich crystals align with the magnetic field. Now, when crystals align to the magnetic north, like today, it's called a normal polarity. But when they align to magnetic south, it's called a reverse polarity. And the magnetic field flips every tens to hundred thousands of years, or even up to millions of years. Now, when this material gets extruded either side of a ridge, it aligns to the magnetic field at the time. And you create this mirror image over time of the different reverse and normal polarities.
It's as like materials coming up and then being pushed away from that.
Exactly, yeah. And as it spreads apart from the ridge and goes towards the edge of the oceans, we can see this sort of almost like zebra stripes of black and white from the different polarities as the magnetic field flips in different directions.
That's
and
really
then
cool.
The minerals align to different directions.
And things are older the further out you go.
Exactly, yeah. And because of the different time frames, the strips aren't always identically in width. They're different thicknesses, these widths of polarities, because
depending on when things flip.
Depending on when the magnetic field flips. Exactly.
Cool.
And because it's symmetrical, you can tell about seafloor spreading.
Yeah. So because of these kind of processes, that means that the Earth as we know it today has changed in the past, in the geologic past, and will also change. So in the past, we had things called supercontinents, which is when stuff was all kind of stuck together as one big continent. So we had, as I mentioned, Pangaea, which was between the Carboniferous about 340 million years ago to the Jurassic about 180 million years ago. And before that, we had Gondwana, which was from the beginning of the Phanerozoic 550 million years ago and kind of feeding into Pangaea. There was a bit of a kind of transitionary period. And actually, in 250 million years' time, we will then have our new supercontinent when all the continents will stick together again, and that will be called Pangaea Proxima. And at that point, we'll probably produce a new highest mountain range as Africa slams into the Eurasian plate. So basically, Africa hits Europe, collides, and forms a mountain range.
I know the landmass will be huge still, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with humans at that point if we're still around. If the different cultures that have been so separated by oceans actually come together and have this smorgasbord of different people from different areas. It'd be interesting to see what happens.
It almost feels like globalization has accelerated the tectonic process because since we can be more connected, seas don't separate us as much.
Yeah, it's true. But anyway, it's an interesting point.
Yeah, moving on. But that does feed nicely into kind of what we want to talk about next, which is the types of boundaries we have between these plates. So the first one we have is a convergent plate boundary where two plates are moving together. And this can be collisional, like I just mentioned, things slamming into each other, like the Indian plate into the Eurasian plate, forming the Himalayan mountains, a bit like when two cars crash and they kind of crumple and push upwards. we also have subduction zones. So that's where an oceanic plate, which is a little bit denser than the continents, hits a continent and kind of sinks down below it.
The interesting point about that is that, you think that the oceanic crust is 5 kilometers thick, and the continental crust is up to 50 kilometers thick. So it's interesting to think that the oceanic crust is the thing that sinks below the continental crust, but that's because it's denser. And the reason it's denser is because it's made of basalt, which is just denser than the continental crust, which is predominantly sort of granite. And that's why it sinks below.
And when we get this kind of sinking, we start to melt that oceanic plate that is sinking down because it's getting deeper into the earth. Remember, we have that geothermal gradient. So we get a deep trench, and then as we melt it, it creates a buoyant magma that then rises back up through the crust to form a volcanic arc, such as the Aleutian Islands in Alaska or the Andes as well.
Exactly. And I should point out as well that the two continental crusts colliding, because there is no subduction, because they're both as dense as each other.
Yeah.
They smash into each other, that's why the Himalayas are so massive. And it should point out that, we mentioned this on a previous episode actually, but Mount Everest is growing by a few millimeters every year still. So this collision's still happening.
Yeah.
And the similar sort of collision happened during Pangaea, where you had the Appalachian Mountains in the US, the remnants of a larger mountain range that formed during the time of Pangaea. And it's actually weird to know that the Appalachians, the Scottish Highlands, the Little Atlas of Morocco, and a few other mountains all around the world are all part of the same mountain range initially, called the Central Pangaea Mountains. But that's up to about 360 million years ago in the Carboniferous, when this all started to break apart.
So those are our convergent plate boundaries. Do you want to talk a bit about divergent plate
Love
boundaries?
you don't want to elaborate. Just thought I made a really interesting point just then. You just moved on, but don't worry about it. Yeah, I can talk about divergent. So the idea is that two plates are moving apart from each other. So we've talked about seafloor spreading already, and talked about rift valleys as well. And this general idea is something called ridge push, where you have this idea that magma wells up in the center of this rift, and it creates ridges on the seafloor, and the new material on the surface cools, becomes denser, and moves down away from the ridge and causes the plates to sort of move away from each other. And I think these are the kind of areas where you might see hydrothermal vents as well.
Which is really interesting for kind of the origins of life, because there are some theories that life started to form in these warm pools of water kind of at the bottom of the ocean, where magma was kind of heating up that water. And so it's a kind of a particularly interesting research topic, and seeing if we can find these on other planets and moons too.
It's an interesting one because, I'm assuming that's tiny little bacteria rather than, things with eyes and mouths and stuff as being life.
Yeah.
They have to
Like
be a certain temperature.
single-celled organisms.
Single-celled organisms, but these vents can't be too hot, because above 80 degrees, bacteria doesn't seem to be able to live, or very little does. So it's a fine. It has to be very specific conditions in these vents.
Things must have been very finely tuned for life to
originally flourish. One of the major examples of this divergent plate boundary is actually the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's at a spreading rate of a few centimeters a year. And actually, we have Iceland, which represents an area along this Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is a hotspot, which is essentially an anomalous hot zone in the mantle under the surface. And this first appeared on the ocean surface 16 to 18 million years ago. And actually, you can see the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, or you can swim in it in Iceland. Actually, you can swim in this major ridge that basically extends all the way through the ocean.
Wow.
It's absolutely incredible. And it's this basically this thin point between the North American and Eurasian plate.
So you can stand between plates.
Yeah, you can bathe in it.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And our last example of a plate boundary is a transform boundary. It's also got a conservative boundary as well, I think, which is actually kind of ironic because they can be quite violent and aggressive in terms of earthquakes and stuff.
Yeah. So transform boundaries are when we get two plates kind of sliding alongside each other, basically accommodating all this other movement that you've got pushing together and pulling apart across the Earth. And a really good example of this is the San Andreas Fault, which kind of cuts through California. It's about 800 miles long and it's 10 miles deep. And effectively, when you get these things rubbing together, sometimes stress builds up in the rocks because they can't smoothly push past each other. And when that stress gets released, that's when you get earthquakes, such as the really famous 1906 earthquake produced by the San Andreas Fault, which caused a lot of devastation. But A lot of these processes do happen at plate boundaries, and this has given rise to something called the Ring of Fire, which is basically this zone surrounding the Pacific Ocean of volcanoes and earthquakes, really high tectonic activity. 90% of all earthquakes happen here, and 75% of all active volcanoes are around this ring. So, it's this 40,000 kilometer horseshoe with over 450 volcanoes extending from the bottom of South America all the way up to kind of Alaska, down past Japan, and down to New Zealand. So it's massive.
I mean, it's funny when we have all these different cities and urban areas built around the Ring of Fire.
Yeah.
It sounds apocalyptic almost, doesn't
it? Yes, yeah. But it shows the importance of understanding this kind of work. It shows the importance of having people who do seismology, because it's all hazard warning systems, things like that.
Yeah, and actually, of course as well, that people are going to be building cities around these areas because they're next to oceans, so very good for ports and shipping lanes, and also volcanoes produce very good fertile soil for agriculture, for initial civilizations to set up.
Yeah.
So we've established the different plate boundaries, but what drives continental breakup? It used to be believed that convection currents within the mantle helped sort of move these plates around, like currents in the ocean, moving like a piece of wood, or
a message in a bottle.
A message in a bottle, to a loved one or to an enemy.
I don't think you can choose.
No, good point.
I think that's the point.
Well, I mean, anyway, so these convection currents aren't really considered because there's little evidence for currents moving these plates.
And actually, so there was a paper published by Yaoling Niu, who's from Durham University, in 2020 in the Journal of Asian Earth Scientists. And he basically said that the reason plates move and things break up is all to do with slab pull, which is related to subduction zones, so things being pulled down into the mantle, which then causes all the other movements we see.
Exactly. I think slab pull, this idea that a plate's getting sort of dragged underneath the continental plate. It must depend massively on sort of the angle at which it's getting subducted, the interface between the continental and oceanic plates. It must be so many different factors that are very intricate and detailed, very hard to establish.
Yeah, and he found that there is a relationship between the speed that plates move and the amount of their circumference that is in a subduction zone, which was kind of evidence for slab pull being the main driver.
Right. Yeah, and obviously we've got these subduction zones that form volcanoes and produce earthquakes, but there are a lot of volcanoes that are found far from boundaries. Hawaii being one of them.
Yeah, so this was actually kind of pioneered by a guy called John Tuzo Wilson in 1963, and he suggested that Hawaii and other volcanic island chains formed due to fixed hotspots in the mantle, so fixed areas in the Earth where material is rising up, and then as the plate moves over those areas, you get chains of volcanoes. So you imagine the plate is sitting over a hotspot, creates volcano, plate moves along, create new volcano, and that's what's formed Hawaii. And Hawaii's been erupting lava for about 70 million years. So actually, if you look to the northwest of Hawaii, if you were able to drain all the oceans, you would see lots of submerged volcanoes, because these are all those older volcanoes that formed much earlier and have now kind of been submerged under the oceans.
And are no longer active in terms of volcanoes because they've moved over the hotspot.
Yeah, exactly.
And currently there is another island that's being produced at the moment called Lo'ihi, which is 975 meters below sea level and should emerge in the next 100,000 years or so.
Great.
As a new island where people can live and, well, it might be quite volcanic at the start.
Yeah. Presumably this will just keep going until that hotspot plume kind of stops producing.
Yeah. But because of the distance between each island and the age of each island, you can tell the speed of the plate movement. And so you've already said that it's moving in a northwest direction. But from this island, the islands extend 2,400 kilometers, and they get older from southeast to northwest, which calculates a plate movement of around 7 centimeters a year, which is about the rate at which fingernails grow. So yeah, it's good for telling direction of travel and the rate at which the plate is moving.
And this feeds in nicely to maybe what we can kind of round this out on is looking at other worlds, other planets, other moons, things like that. So on these other worlds, we do get hotspots, but the Earth is unique in having a plate tectonic regime, as far as we know. We haven't found anything else that has plates that move around. There are places that might have evidence of this. So Mars, for example, has the Mariner Valley, which is 3,000 kilometers long, 600 kilometers wide, and this big kind of scar in the surface, which might be due to some kind of tectonic activity, but we're not sure because a lot of these planets have what we would call a lithospheric lid. So basically, it's just this kind of all-encompassing lid around the surface where we don't get tectonics.
Pretty much like how the Earth was before the breakup. It
Yeah.
had this initial magma ocean that cooled, crystallized, and formed this lithospheric lid.
Yeah, yeah. And on Venus, there are some people who thought it did once have plate tectonics. There is crust on the surface that's thought to be younger than 1 billion years old, and there are some ridges on the surface that may be due to tectonics, but it's thought that actually this might all be driven by mantle plumes. And there was a paper in Nature in 2017 by DeVay et al. Suggesting that upwelling of mantle plumes produce fractures, and then you get lava spreading and flooding out onto the surface that cause bending of the surface of the crust and ultimately subduction. So that might be where we get subduction, but without plate movement.
Okay. Would you still get probably earthquakes?
I imagine you would, because you see these ridges, and even on Mercury, this is really cool. So Mercury's tectonically dead, but it is shrinking over time. The core is contracting as it cools, and you get all sorts of faults as it kind of accommodates this contraction. This was there was work done in 2016 in Nature Geoscience by Thomas Waters, finding these scarps, which are like stepped ridges on the surface that are younger than 50 million years old, showing that there is still movement. So Mercury is basically like a fruit drying up as kind of the surface goes all shrivelly.
Little raisin.
Yeah.
Wow, that's epic actually. I didn't realise Mercury was shrinking. Interesting. Would that have any? I mean, we've got a bit off topic here. Would that have any implications for Earth in terms of how all the planets orbit each other or anything like that?
I imagine. I'm not sure. I'm not a orbital dynamicist.
Well, if there are any orbital dynamicists that are listening in, give us a call.
If not, we should work out how to tap into that audience.
Yeah, exactly. I think that'll conclude today. We've covered all the different types of plate boundaries. We've even related it to Venus and Mars.
The one remaining question is, why are they called plates? It's not obvious. Like, do plates even float? I don't know. Maybe we can leave that to our listeners, and they can. It's
on their plate now.
There we go. What a way to finish.
I was looking for one to finish on. Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for joining me again, Mark.
Thank you.
And see you again next time.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.